Hello, good evening. Oh, wait, just... All right, good evening. How is everybody this evening? Hello, good evening, and welcome to the Archaeology Files. Tonight we're going to be looking at Noah's Ark, where it potentially landed, some of the stories that have emerged from Noah's Ark. So we're going to dive right on in. If you have any questions during the course of the program, please do let me know in the comment section. We will be answering those live as we go. So for this evening, what we're going to do is we're going to just kick it right off with a word of prayer, and then we will get into our topic of discussion. So bow your heads with me, and as we pray. Dear Lord, please help us to learn more about your word as we dive into the story of Noah's Ark. Please let us keep an open mind as we look at the individuals and the locations where it potentially came to rest, and guide us in our studies. In your name we pray, amen. So, Noah's Ark. What am I talking about when I talk about Noah's Ark? Well, we've got to go all the way back to the beginning, the absolute very beginning, when God first created the earth. When God created the earth, there was two individuals, Adam and Eve, and this is also recorded not only in the Bible, but in all sorts of mythologies from around the world. This is a cylinder seal that came from Sumeria and Sumer. This is depicting an image of a man and a woman with a tree. This is known as the tree of life in some of the Gentile mythologies. And behind the woman is a snake, and the man is wearing ram's horns. So this goes back to the story of Adam and Eve in the fall, and we see this in the region surrounding Babylonia and Upper Mesopotamia. So after God created the world and man sinned, God saw that the wickedness of man was great all over, and there was nothing that they weren't saying, hey, hands off, we're not doing this. They were doing everything that they could imagine that was evil. So God decided to send a warning. We can read about this in Genesis 6:3 and in Amos 3:7. He sent a warning. And the sad thing is that it only took 10 generations for them to get to this point. If we are looking at Genesis chapter 5, we get a list of all of the generations from Adam to Noah. And it's only 10 generations that totals up to only 1,656 years from creation. Now, where is that in reference to today? Well, in today's terminology, we use BC and AD dating. So we would be looking back around the year 2321 BC for a flood. These dates are approximations based on what we know from the Bible and from history, but we're looking sometime around 2321 BC. So we're going back almost to the very beginning. Jesus, Peter, Paul, they all believed that Noah was real. And if they believed that Noah was real and presented Noah as real, and we know that Jesus was telling the truth and that Peter and Paul were telling the truth, so that lets us know that the story of Noah actually did happen. And we can read about Jesus and Peter and Paul commenting on Noah all through the New Testament in the verses that are listed. When we are going through and we are looking at what happened during the flood, is there any evidence outside of the Bible here? Yes, we actually do have references of the flood outside of the Bible. This was told by Noah's descendants, and we actually have a Sumerian kings list that lists 8 rulers from the beginning of the world till a great flood. And if we're looking through the line of Cain specifically, we are looking at 8 generations from Adam until the last of Cain's descendants is given in Genesis chapter 4. One of the best known accounts is actually from an individual known as Gilgamesh. If you were with us last evening, you know that there is a very famous statue of Gilgamesh, and I am actually going to hold up this statue of Gilgamesh so that you can take a look at it. If we can see it here, we have Gilgamesh, who is holding a lion, and the lion is much smaller than Gilgamesh here. So Gilgamesh, this is a Gilgamesh statue. We also know through some of the tablets that were left behind, they're called the Epic of Gilgamesh, and here is one of the, this is a replica of the tablets. This is tablet XI, also known as tablet 11 of the Gilgamesh Epic, where it talks about the story of a great flood, and the account that is in the Epic of Gilgamesh actually very closely resembles the biblical account, so much so that some scholars believe and promote the idea that the Hebrews stole the idea of Noah's flood from the Epic of Gilgamesh, instead of the Epic of Gilgamesh recounting a true literal story, or is just another version of the same event that 2 different people groups were recording for as their histories. Okay. So when we are looking at the kings lists, and then we go to the representations that we are seeing in other cultures, almost every single culture actually has some type of story of a flood. Now, is it always a universal destruction? No. But almost all of the stories, like 80 to 90% of the stories involve a universal destruction. Does it involve man and sin? Some of the stories do, some of the stories don't. But there's common elements throughout them all, such as destruction by water, man being saved, a particular family or a group of particular people that are saved when everybody else does not manage to make it on the boat. This is just a brief chart showing a representation of a variety of cultures that have flood stories. Blue indicates that it is a full representation, and gray represents a partial representation. That would be something along the lines of it was some type of a vessel, maybe not an ark, might have been a basket, or it's implied that there was a vessel, but that we can see elements of that in the story. Some of the vessels, there's a variety. So when we're looking at the Hebrew versions, we're seeing a barge-like vessel. The Sumerians have a story that is like a basket or a round vessel. The Babylonians describe it as a cube, almost like a ziggurat in some cases. The Greeks, it's more like literally a chest or that type of an ark. The Hindus have a story where it was a canoe that they attached a rope to for the sea god, and the sea god was a fish with a horn on it, and that they attached the rope to the horn. Some of the Native American stories tell about, the people surviving on the back of a turtle. So there's a wide variety of different types of vessels that are used, but the common point is that there was a vessel that was being used. Now, Noah, as you can see from this last slide, we see that the cultures are up top here, and the name of the individual that was the hero of the story is underneath. But these are all different names for Noah. And when we're looking at this next slide, these are just some of the names from around the world for Noah. In the New Testament, some places he's called Noah, other places he's called No, and this is because of the difference between the Hebrew and the Greek writing style. It's still the same name, it's just the translation from Greek versus the translation from Hebrew. We have the Greeks had two different names. The people that lived and settled in China had two different names because there were multiple cultures. What's interesting is that the people of Hawaii called him Nui. The people in China, the Miao people that live in China, called him Nua, and they actually have a record of the first peoples that settled the planet, starting with Patriarch Dirt. Any guesses on who they were referencing Patriarch Dirt as being the father of everybody? It would definitely be Adam that is being discussed there. Then they go down to Patriarch Noah. They list his wife, but what's very, very interesting about this particular one from the Miao people in China is that they list the names of Noah's sons, which were Lo-Shan, Lo-Han, and Japheth. Now, if you're looking, these people changed the M's that we are familiar with, like Shem and Ham, and they turned them into N's. So Shem became Lo-Shan, Ham became Lo-Han, and Japheth became Japheth. And they trace their lineage through Gomer, which is their version of the word name Gomer, who was a descendant of Japheth. And they also list the names of the first two sons of Ham and the first two sons of Shem. So their traditions and their culture actually extremely closely match what we are seeing the names of the 70 nations in Genesis chapter 10, that table of nations there. Who was Noah? So Noah, he is going to be the father of everybody, after the flood, because everybody who was alive on the face of the planet up until today goes back to Noah. If you're looking at Dead Sea Scroll 4Q534, that tells us a little description of Noah. Now, whether or not that's true, traditionally, the Dead Sea Scrolls have some factual information in them. Sometimes they have tidbits that are not biblical, but according to this particular scroll, it says that Noah had red hair and that he had a birthmark on his face that was in the shape of a lentil, and that this was to identify him as the one who was selected by God, because according to the scroll, it was given the information about the flood and who was going to be the one to give that final message was given to either Methuselah or Lamech. And they were told, this is how you will know which child is going to be the one that I have chosen for this. So that's a little bit of interesting information, not directly from the Bible. So it's a give or take, but it's a little bit of interesting information to note. Now, Noah's ancestry, we got a brief view of it earlier. This is the information that we have from the Bible. This is the names of all of the individuals that we know of that existed prior to the flood, based on Genesis chapters 4 and Genesis chapters 5. When you're looking at some of the ages and we're lining them up, this is what we're looking at. So Adam died shortly before Noah was born, but all of the previous generations could have heard the story of the fall directly from Adam himself. So we have a very long time span in which we have all of these generations living and working potentially with one another. So there was really no excuse for them to have, the world to have fallen in such a sinful state, because they still had, living memory from perfection. But they chose not to maintain God's will. And so God had to preserve the earth, and to preserve it, he had to destroy it first. When you're looking at the traditional writings, some people like to look at things like the Book of Jasher. Now, the Book of Jasher does have elements in it that are not biblical. It contradicts Scripture. But a lot of people will read the Book of Jasher. And according to the Book of Jasher, this gives an idea of who some of the women were that are not named in Genesis 4 and 5, and places a connection there, stating that, Noah married, one of the daughters of Enoch, and that, everybody that was on the boat were closely related, which we already knew that they were closely related. But the Book of Jasher has different information in it than what we see in the Book of Jubilees, which is another traditional writing that also there are tidbits in it that are like fun facts, but there's also information in it that contradicts Scripture. So I would be very leery of, taking either one as gospel truth. But this, in the Book of Jubilees, it gives very detailed information about exactly, who this one's wife was and who her father was and how he related to the next one, and gives information about all of the line leading up to Noah. So that gives you a little bit of an idea about who Noah was. Now, what is Noah most famous for? It wasn't for simply existing, it was for the big ship that he was in charge of. So when we're looking at, hey, did the story of Noah happen? Well, let's look for the actual archaeological evidence that we have. And the biggest piece of archaeological evidence would literally be the boat itself. So the first question is going to be, where was the boat? So I'm going to give y'all a minute to think about this. The question is, did the ark land in location A, which would be the mountains of Ararat, or did the ark rest in location B, which would be on Mount Ararat itself? So I'm going to give you a couple of seconds here to type in your answers or to think about it and silently take a guess in your brain to see if you're going to be correct. And we will see if anybody wants to be brave enough to post their answer. All right, so I've given you a second to think about, which answer you think is the correct one. So when we are looking at the location for where the ark came to rest, what we're going to do is we are going to turn to our Bibles, because our Bibles have all the answers that we need to know. And our Bibles are going to have that answer in Genesis 8, verse 4. So if you wanted to turn to Genesis 8, verse 4, the answer is, there we go. I see we have an answer in the comments. Chris says A, and that would be correct. And the ark rested upon the mountains of Ararat. And if you want to go to a Bible commentary or a Bible dictionary and you look up the word Ararat, the word Ararat actually means the name that is properly of a region, not of a mountain. That is very important, because when we are looking at the writings of Josephus, and if you're unfamiliar with Josephus, Josephus was a historian who lived around the time of Christ, and Josephus writes in the Antiquities of the Jews, Volume 1, Book 3, he writes that, quote, "The Armenians call this the place of descent, for the ark remains are shown there by the inhabitants to this day." So it was a region in Armenia, and this is where the ark came to rest. And Josephus says that it was still there and visible during his day and age. And we have other individuals who wrote about the ark and said, hey, guess what? The ark is here. We can still see it. This was from the Chaldeans, the Chaldeans, the Egyptians, the Syrians. They're all writing and saying that, you can see this. Eusebius even wrote that there was a small part of the boat that could still be seen in the mountains of Armenia. So they could still see it there. And when we're talking about what constituted the original, location of Armenia, we're not going to be looking at the same borders of the countries that we're seeing today. So when we are looking on a map and we're looking at a Bible dictionary, the Brown Drivers Briggs says that it is a mountainous region of eastern Armenia between the river and two different lakes. So in blue, I have highlighted the river that they are referring to. So this was one of the boundaries for the region of Armenia. And then the two lakes, the one was Lake Van and the other was Lake Umayyah. And these two lakes represented boundary points for the ancient land of Armenia, or the ancient land of Ararat. And that would be what was the area that's highlighted in red here that you can see. This area would have been considered the ancient region of Armenia. Now, when we're looking at this, do we see a mountain in that area? But not just one mountain, it has to be a region that is mountainous. And when we look, why, yes, we do. So there actually is a mountain that is called Mount Ararat. It sits at 16,853 feet tall. It is the highest peak in Turkey. It has a degree of 35, it has an angle of 35 degrees, which means that this is a very steep mountain. In the background right here, we can see off to your left, this is what is known as Lesser Ararat, which is another very, very high peak. It is 12,800 feet. So Greater Ararat is about 4,000 feet taller. There have been 40 plus expeditions on this mountain that we have documented that have been searching for the Ark. But one of the questions that has come up is, how did this mountain form? Well, this mountain is actually a volcanic mountain. And as a volcanic mountain, it is prone to some very violent eruptions. There has been a debate on whether this mountain even existed at the time of the flood, or if it didn't come into existence much, much later. We do have precedents for such mountains occurring, not to this great height extent, but there have been volcanoes in like a field in Mexico, that weren't there the one day, and then, a couple of weeks later, we've got a volcano that's hundreds of feet tall. So we do have precedents for seeing volcanoes grow in great height in relatively short amounts of time. So it's possible this mountain wasn't even there at the time of Noah's flood. But also, if it was there shortly after the flood, because of the very steep angle, we're talking about unloading the ark of all of its occupants. It's not just Noah's family that's getting off of the ark. We're talking about also getting the animals off the ark. So how are we going to get these animals off of the ark when it is such a steep angle? There's a very steep angle, and it's not likely that we're going to get animals any larger than what you could carry off of this mountain. Like I said, this mountain is a volcanic mountain. This is the view from the northeast looking towards the southwest. If we spin the camera around and do a satellite image, we're going to be looking at a valley here, and in the midst of this valley, we're going to have a Mount Ararat Greater, and then to its side over here off to the right is Mount Ararat Lesser. So one of the first recorded individuals to take a gander at this after the time of Christ is actually Saint Jacob or James of Eusebius. Yes, it was a tourist attraction and a pilgrimage site. We do have records of that, heaven soon, where it's recorded that people would go there, and one of the it would be this St. James, who really, after the time of Christ, was doing that sort of thing. So St. James, we have, some of his relics. We know where his tomb is. Some of the things that he brought back are in a museum in Armenia right now. And one of those things that he brought back from his journeys is where he had been at Mount Ararat itself. And he claimed that he found a piece of wood on the mountain, and they brought this piece of wood back when the expedition returned, and it was placed into this little box where it's, you know, covered in gold, and they've made it into a relic where people could come and visit it and pay, you know, indulgences or money to touch it. And like, so this was one of the things that it was becoming a tourist attraction. We have records of people that occasionally throughout the years, St. James was there around the 300s AD. The next really big recording that we have that I want to mention today is by Johann Parrot. He is actually recorded as the individual to make the first ascent to the peak, and this was in 1829. So he is the first recorded ascent to the top of Mount Ararat. And shortly after he made this ascent in 1829, the volcano actually erupted very violently. There was what they're estimating as a 7.4 earthquake, and when this earthquake happened, there was a pyroclastic flow, and the side of the mountain, it was kind of like a Mount St. Helens event. The side of the mountain, which you can see on the upper middle portion of your screen, that blew out the side of the mountain. It created a crater that was 400 meters wide, over 100 meters deep in some places. Other places, this gorge is now deeper, you know, than places in the Grand Canyon. Here is a picture of this large section of the mountain that was removed in 1840, and you can see this gap. This is called the Hora Gorge area, and it is extremely steep. And interestingly enough, this is one of the locations that is most searched for Noah's Ark. This is an artist rendition of what the mountain may have looked like after, you know, the volcanic activity settled down in between the time of the 1850s to the early 1900s. But you can still see where this gorge would have been. Mountain climbers today, this is what you kind of have to dress like to reach the peak. It's very cold, oftentimes, or almost always snow covered. You have to take a lot of equipment. Here is a photo of the gorge and where you have to climb. I don't see anybody getting an elephant off the side of this mountain, and this has been the focus of a great many of the hunts for Noah's Ark, because some of the stories have said that you know, this Hora Gorge is where Noah's Ark actually came to rest, and, you know, we've got evidence of it, but it is extremely, extremely steep. It's solid rock, solidified ash from all of the volcanic eruptions. Here's another picture of the side. It doesn't really show, give a true vision of just how steep and uninhabitable this gorge is. Viscount James Bryce. He is another famous individual who in the 1870s decided that he was going to ascend and he was going to go look for Noah's Ark. And during his journey, he found a 4-foot long, 5-inch wide piece of wood that he felt was cut by some tool, and that it was so far above the tree line that, you know, there was no possibility of, you know, it being just a natural fragment that was out there. At the place where he found this log, it was at 13,000 feet, so approximately, you know, 3,000-ish feet from the top. He cut a portion to bring back with him, and he later claims that, yeah, this was a piece of Noah's Ark. But later he actually wrote that if there be any remains of the Ark on Mount Ararat at all, it's going to be here rather than at the top, and no man is actually bound to discredit his own relic. He wouldn't let anybody else view the relic. It's been lost to time, and it's highly suspect, and a lot of individuals believe that he, in his later years, came to the understanding that this was not a piece of Noah's Ark itself. Now, did he find a piece of wood up there? Quite possible. Was it a piece of Noah's Ark? Highly suspect. Then we start getting into other written accounts. So one of the famous accounts was from a guy called Yeram. He lived in Armenia. He also migrated to the United States. His father was a guide in the 1850s, and he himself didn't start telling this story until after he almost died of dysentery. This was about 5 years before he actually died, and so he started telling the story of how, his father, was able to personally see Noah's Ark, and, he had been up there multiple times. And so he told this story to the Williams family. The Williams family wrote down some of what he had been telling them, but all of their records burned in the 1940s. So after their records burned in the 1940s, the Williams family then started talking with the Cummings family, and Violet began collecting some of the stories that had been told from the 1940s on through until the 80s. Now, we're starting to get into a game of telephone here, because Yeram possibly did or did not witness the Ark himself. He gave his account while he was ill during his last years to a family, which it may not have been to one of the younger members of the family. It may or may not have been to one of the older members of the family. But they were writing what he had told them. Then everything that they had written burned. And so much later, somebody else comes along, and after listening to their account of the other person's account of the person's account of their father, you see where we're starting to get some leeway for not quite accurate renditions of, hey, this is exactly what was seen. So it is definitely a game of telephone that we're looking at when we're reading some of the stuff that's coming from any of these individuals. One of the most famous accounts of the Ark being on Mount Ararat comes from George Hagopian. George Hagopian claims that somewhere between 1902 and 1912, when he was either 8 or 10 years old, that his uncle carried him up the side of the mountain, and they spent the afternoon walking along the top of a moss-covered Noah's Ark, and that the uncle, he couldn't chop off a piece of wood, but the one account says that he, fired off a weapon, and it wouldn't penetrate the hull of the ship. But this is a very suspect story, and the reason that it's suspect is he's given a variety of ages in his accounts. In the one account he's 5, in the other account he's 10. In the one account he walked, in the other account his uncle had him on his shoulders. I don't see, a 10-year-old riding the shoulders of an uncle halfway up the steep mountain. You saw the pictures that I showed earlier, showing, they were using walking sticks and thick and heavy coats to climb up this 16,000 foot mountainside. And George Hagopian is stating that, oh no, during the lunch hour, him and his uncle just went right on up the side of that mountain and saw the boat and made a field day of it and came back in time for dinner. So that doesn't necessarily match some of the other accounts. He gives a description, says that, some accounts say that he saw the whole thing. Some accounts said, no, I didn't see the whole thing. It was just buried on in the ice, and we could see a portion of this. But in all of the subsequent searches for the Ark, it is not shown up in satellite imagery. It is not shown up in radar scans. Nobody has seen hide nor hair of it in any of the expeditions of the people that have gone through that same gorge area looking for this vessel, and you cannot see it. They've looked for it with the ice there. There have been times in history where the ice has, receded, and they've looked for it. They cannot find it at all. So other than George Hagopian's account from when he was a child, there is literally no physical evidence that supports that he actually saw the Ark there. Now, do I think he saw something? He very well may have. He may have found a hunter's cabin, a refuge that was placed there at some point for climbers, because we do know that people were making expeditions up the mountain for a great number of years. So it is very possible that, maybe somebody's cabin was there, or their shelter was there that they had built specifically for the tourism expeditions going up the side of the mountain. So I'm not discounting the fact that he saw something up there. However, there is literally no evidence that he saw Noah's Ark up there. Then we get to a very famous captain. So this captain was doing surveys. He was examining surveys from aerial imagery that had been taken during World War II. This was in 1959, and he spotted something, and it made news. So when they spotted it, they sent out a group of individuals to go investigate the site. And this is a copy of the article from Life magazine. This is 1960. The article itself was only 244 words. There was more words in the shoe advertisement that was underneath of this than there actually was pertaining to this particular event. So the Turkish government sent an expedition to the location that was showing up on the satellite imagery. And of course, when you send the army to do an investigation of a potential historic site, what is the first thing that they're going to want to do to determine if the site is in fact great historical significance? Of course, they're going to use some of that leftover ordnance from World War II and blow a hole in the side of it to determine if this indeed actually is the most famous ancient ship in history. And you can see right here a very large gap in the side of the structure where the army used their ordnance to create this hole. You can actually see it in some of the images, some of the underground radar images. And you can still see where there's the hole and where the all those little specks in red indicates damaged areas and portions that were damaged because of the hole. So this site, it's not on Mount Ararat. It is very close by to Mount Ararat. It is the only location that can actually be revisited. It is the only location where you can actually perform scientific studies. It is the only location that has been made available to multiple researchers worldwide. And here is an image of said location. So you can see this U-shaped mountain in the background. This is actually interesting because in some of the stories about Noah's Ark that come out of France, it describes a mountain of this exact shape as located right next to where Noah's Ark came to rest. And that was actually one of the marking points that they said, hey, when you get to this mountain that is shaped like this, that's where you're going to find the boat. And so it's quite interesting that we can still see that mountain shape today. This is the image that was in question, but this is what it looks like now. What it looked like back when the Army went to go investigate this was actually this. This is the image. It was kind of sunken into the ground slightly. The ground level was at or even above the edges of the object in question. Then the individuals, the researchers that were looking at this site, they could not get permission to excavate. And they needed to excavate to be able to determine, hey, is this, what we think it is, or is this something that is not even feasible? So they prayed about it. And after they prayed about it, it wasn't very long until a news story came on about this massive earthquake in Turkey. And so after the earthquake, here we go, it self-excavated the starboard side. Totally and completely, the ground just dropped away. You can actually see right here, this is one of the fault lines running through the area. There are several fault lines. This is an area that is subject to earthquakes. Here is another view. This is from the image on the left is from 1961. The image on the right is from an overhead image that was taken in 2019. And you can actually see running along here is one of the fault lines. Just to give you an idea about how large this object is, this right here is an individual. This would have been stern side of the object that we're looking at. This is an individual. This is a very large formation that we are investigating. And when you're investigating this, there appears to be beams or posts at regular intervals that are popping out of the ground. And these are a standard size. They're not random. They are uniformly placed all along this edge of the object in question. So I'm going to leave it up to you to decide, what you think of this object, but this is where we are going to be looking at for our investigation from this point forward, because all of the other potential locations that we have discussed today, none of those sightings actually have any physical evidence left behind. This location is the only location where we can actually examine it to determine if it meets the qualifications for being considered a possibility for being the remains of Noah's Ark. So that brings us to the question of, hey, would there be anything left of a 4,300-ish year old wooden boat? So I'm going to ask that in the comments section, you go ahead and pop your answers in there. Do you think that there is going to be anything left of a 4,000-year-old wooden ship? Would we expect to see some remains from Noah's Ark? Or do you think that it's been, too far in history and weathering for there to be any remains at all left from this this massive ship that is the first ship that we have any record of in history. That was pretty much, almost back at creation as we're looking. So my question to you is, do you think that there actually is anything left of that? And while you're pondering that, I want to show you pictures of some of the resistivity scans. Resistivity scans, just think of them like underwater sonar. But they're actually, instead of being underwater, they're just going below the surface of the ground level, and they're sending out signals, and based on the type of matter that they hit, they send back message to the machine, and you can get an image. So when you do the resistivity scans of this formation that a great number of people have called, oh no, this is just a natural formation, nothing here to see, this is actually what you see. So this portion along the top here, that would be ground level. And then this would be, if you were under the ground looking up towards the ground, this is what you're going to see. What does this object, what does this look like to you? This area up here, we've got some damage, not quite intact. There's some damage and some not quite solid formations that are going on up here. I believe that this is the location where that test group from the 1960s did their experiments on. But as we're looking at this, what shape does this remind you of? It, to me, looks very similar to the hull of a ship. You will notice, if you are looking from the stern of the ship, that would have been the back of the object in question, if indeed it is a ship, there is a portion that's right here off to the right that we can look at that actually has completely become detached. So it has a different density from the rest of the surrounding area, but is completely detached. So the ground itself is filling in the gap between the main object in question and this object that has broken off and is laying on its side. So the object in question itself is not lying flat, it is actually lying at an angle. All right, so now going back, yes, 29 of a kind. Absolutely think it's possible because of the high altitude and the dry climate. That is a very good synopsis. So when we're looking at the potential area for Noah's Ark, I'd like to submit Exhibit A, Mallows Bay. So Mallows Bay is a location that is on the Potomac River between Virginia and Maryland. And during World War I, they were making ships here. And they didn't finish the ships before the war ended. So the ships kind of just sat around for a while, and then they decided that, hey, we can't have all of these ships sitting around. What are we going to do with them? So they decided that they were going to burn them and sink them in the river. So that is exactly what they did for over 100 ships. So they sank them. They're currently sitting there today. You can actually, it's a great spot to go kayaking, and there's lots of wildlife in the area because the wildlife has made these remnants of the ships their homes. But if you're looking overhead through the water, and this water is not necessarily the clearest water there is, but you can still see the outlines of the ships from an overhead view. This is a wonderful area. There's along the river there, you can actually go collecting shark's teeth and other fossils. Yes. Yes, we do have objects that have been preserved. I totally agree. The pyramids, because of the dry climate of the pyramids that we had there. So when we're looking at other ships, we have ships that are like the Sea of Galilee boat. This is, some people call it the Jesus boat or the Jesus ship. This is a boat that was pulled out of the Sea of Galilee. They date it back to around 100 AD. It was 27 feet long, 7.5 feet wide. It's a very shallow bottom because of the area where it was found. You would need it to be of a more shallow nature so that you could pull right up to shore. This particular ship, it had been patched so many times it couldn't be patched anymore. Who knows how long it had been into service, but after they were done using it, they just sank it. And it was preserved in the mud under the water for the past approximately 2,000-ish years. So this is an example, one of the most famous examples of a submerged boat. But then we also have what is called the Dead Fleet of the Delaware River. This was a pier that the pier and the ships collapsed and were sank in the 1930s, and we can still see the remnants of them today. Another great example where you wouldn't think is the Arabia. This was found in a farm field in a farm field. It was the Missouri River actually at one point went through the farm field. But after the ship sank there in 1856, the river shifted. And it shifted so far that nobody really thought that the river ever went through this farm field until they were, I don't know if they were just plowing the field or digging, or somebody thought, well, you know what, maybe the river, did come through here, and they tracked it down. But once they started digging, they were able to dig down, and look how far they had to dig down to be able to get this ship from 1856. All of that mud and dirt and silt from 1856 is where this riverboat was. You wouldn't think that seeing, the very poor shape that this is in this picture, you wouldn't think, hey, we're going to find a lot of stuff in there. But it is amazing what they were able to pull out of that ship, totally preserved. Just look at all of these boots. These were leather boots and leather goods that they were able to salvage from this ship. And in addition to all of these leather goods, they were also able to pull canned goods that are supposedly still good. I myself wouldn't want to try these. I'm more than content to let them still be canned, but from some experts' opinions, these canned goods are actually still perfectly preserved and good for consumption. So we could still find those from this ship from the 1860s. The Endurance, this sank in the Atlantic Ocean in the 1915. It's very well preserved. We've got cannons from 1682. The Sutton Hoo ship, this was a burial ship that was from, think back, Viking age. It was almost 90 feet long. It was from the 600s AD. And if you actually look up at the end of the ship that's up at this end, at the top of the screen, they actually know that a 9-foot tall body was there based on the decomp that they were able to observe and record. And just pay attention to this ship. Keep it in the back of your mind, because we are going to come back to this ship. It does play a part in some of our investigation. But this is them excavating this Sutton Hoo ship. The Osberg ship is another Viking burial ship that they were able to uncover, and it's very, very well preserved. This is from around the time of the 800s. And here's another picture of this ship that has been preserved. And so this ship, along with the other one, these were all preserved in water. We do have examples of, a dry, arid climate, of things from ancient Egypt surviving thousands of years. We have mummies from all around the world. So we do have objects that have survived relatively intact for thousands and thousands of years. So when we are looking at Noah's Ark, there is a standard that, hey, we actually might be able to find something. It would not be beyond the realm of possibilities. So we are going to actually conclude today's presentation with that fact, and we will pick it up again next week, same time, Saturday, 6 p.m. Eastern, where we will continue our investigation. We're going to start with, the size of Noah's Ark, some of the basics. We're going to be really looking into Genesis chapter 6 through 9 and learning about, what does the Bible say about the ark itself, and what can we expect to see? If we were looking for this, what are the things that we are going to expect to see? What would be the things that would make us say, yes, this matches the biblical account? Do we have any questions? I've gotten some great comments throughout the program. Now is the time if you have any questions about anything that we have covered today, or things that we haven't covered today. I am more than willing to answer those now. I do like to keep the program interactive. Any feedback, that would be greatly appreciated. If you think of something after the program, you can email, you can submit it on the Q&A form that you can find on our website. You can, after the program, you can submit it to the comment section in YouTube so that we can see that, and I can make sure that we get those questions answered during the next program for this particular topic, and questions that don't pertain to this topic we'll try to get on our Friday night program. So if you have any questions, now would be the time to ask those questions. All right. I say, do other archaeologists agree that this site is Noah's Ark? So that is a very hotly debated topic. As far as degreed archaeologists, I do not know of any degreed archaeologists that will proclaim freely that they believe that this is the Noah's Ark site. But keeping that in mind, the professionals, degreed people, are the ones that built the Titanic, and the amateurs are the ones that built Noah's Ark, and you tell me which ship was better prepared. So I don't put much stock in a degree. I put more stock in, let's look at the evidence, let's look at the Bible, and let's make an educated statement and opinion based upon those topics and those subjects, rather than, what somebody else says just because they don't want it to be, or they disagree with a person's philosophy, rather than be willing to actually examine the evidence. I don't care who found a site. I don't care what the history of it is. I want to actually sit down and examine it, see what the evidence says, without basing an opinion on, well, so and so said this and I believe so and so and everything, so I'm not even gonna give it a look. I don't think that's a good way to approach anything. I'd like to get a variety of opinions. Ask the questions. Ask the tough stuff. If there's not answers for that, maybe there's a reason. So I like to look at it from all angles and say, could this be? Could this not be? Let's take a look. Let's see. Is it just American archaeologists that don't? Is another question that popped up. I don't think so. I think this is more of a worldwide thing, a worldwide topic that gets discussion. As far as non-archaeologists, there are a lot of non-archaeologist people that have degrees that have looked at this and said, yay or nay based on their observation of the evidence. So specifically to address, your question of, archaeologists, that proclaim this as a profession versus, other educated individuals who, are closely examining the site or, who have a hand in, doing investigations. I think there's a lot of people out there that are very intelligent individuals who gather the evidence and look at it and make a decision based on what evidence they are looking at, rather than saying, no, it can't possibly be this simply because I disagree with person X. Yes, it is kind of like the Western Wall versus the towers. It's just a matter of, do we want to stick with tradition? Is it because we have a personal disagreement with somebody, or is it because there's literally no evidence that would support this claim? And that's where we kind of have to evaluate for ourselves and be the judge. And that's how we would do that. Okay, I think that's all the questions that we have for tonight. We did run over a little extra today, but I just want to thank everybody for attending. Keep us on your calendars and watch for our Q&A sessions, and just have a really good week, and God bless.